I decided to kick my daughter-in-law out of my house after she disrespected me for the last time. But when the fight ended, she was the one who started packing my clothes, throwing my dresses into trash bags as if I were the intruder. I laughed in her face and told her, "This house is mine, you idiot. Take your husband and get out." I saw the blood rush to her face, saw her clench her fists. Then my son David, my own son, lifted a chair over his head to intimidate me. His eyes were full of rage, the veins standing out on his neck. He thought I would be scared, that I'd burst into tears and run away, but he was wrong. He very quickly regretted raising that chair against me, because what came next changed everything forever. But to understand how we got to that moment of madness, I have to go back years. I have to tell you who I am, Helen Miller, a 67-year-old woman who learned from a young age that in this life, nobody hands you anything. I was 23 when I was widowed. David was barely walking, stumbling on his little legs around the rented apartment where we lived, a tiny place that smelled like dampness and reheated food. My husband died in a workplace accident, something quick and violent that left me alone from one day to the next. No life insurance, no savings, no family who could help me. It was just David and me, against the entire world. I got a job at a textile factory at first, 12-hour shifts that left my hands swollen and my back ruined. The pay barely covered the rent and basic food, but I had something many people don't. I knew how to sew. My mother had taught me since I was a girl, and although the factory work was mechanical and exhausting, I knew I could do much more. I could create, fix, transform fabrics into something beautiful that people would be willing to pay for. I started taking orders at night. While David slept in his little bed, I sewed party dresses, mended pants, and embroidered tablecloths for celebrations. The sewing machine hummed until dawn in that small apartment, and my eyes burned under the yellowish light of the only lamp we had. Every stitch was one more penny closer to something better. Every finished dress was a promise I made to myself. Someday we would have our own house, a place where no one could kick us out. Years passed like that. David grew up, and I aged faster than normal. The wrinkles marked my face before their time. I left the factory when the sewing orders became enough to support us. My clients recommended me to other women, and soon I had more work than I could handle. From dresses, wedding gowns, baptism outfits, my hands never rested, but neither did my dream of having something of my own. I saved every dollar I could for 15 years. I kept the money in a metal box I hid under my bed, crumpled bills that smelled like fabric and sweat. I didn't buy new clothes, I didn't eat out, I didn't go to the movies. Everything I earned went straight into that box, except for what was necessary for David to have decent shoes and be able to study. He was my priority, my reason for getting up every morning with sore fingers and tired eyes. When David turned 18 and got his first office job, I was 38 and had finally saved enough money for the down payment on a house. It wasn't big, and it wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was mine. I signed the papers with trembling hands, and when the closing agent handed me the deed with my name printed on it, I cried like I hadn't cried since my husband's funeral. Helen Miller, homeowner. Those 2 words meant I had won, that all those years of sacrifice had been worth it. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a bathroom that needed repairs, and a living room with windows that let the sunlight in during the mornings. The walls were painted a faded cream color, and the tile floor had cracks, but to me, it was a palace. It was the place where we could finally breathe easily, where no one would knock on the door demanding rent, where we could truly put down roots. I spent weeks fixing up every corner. I painted the walls a light green shade that reminded me of spring, hung white curtains that I sewed myself, polished the old furniture I bought secondhand until it shined like new. David helped me on the weekends, carrying boxes, hammering nails, laughing while we ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches sitting on the floor because we didn't have a table yet. Those were happy days, days full of hope and plans for the future. I set up my sewing machine by the window in my bedroom, where the natural light allowed me to work without straining my eyes so much. The smell of freshly brewed coffee in the mornings mixed with the scent of new fabrics I bought for my projects. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of more than just surviving. I thought that maybe I could expand my business, hire someone to help me, perhaps even open my own little shop someday. David was thriving too. He got promoted at his job, started earning more, and became a responsible and hard-working man. I was so proud of him, of how he had gotten ahead despite growing up without a father, of how he never complained about our limitations when he was a child. I felt blessed, complete. I had my house, my son was on the right track, my sewing business was flourishing. Life was finally smiling at me after so many years of struggle. Then, when David was 26, he met Samantha. At first, Samantha seemed like a normal girl. She came to my house one Sunday afternoon, holding David's hand, smiling with that wide smile that showed all her teeth. She wore a dark green dress and high heels that clicked against the tile floor. She was pretty, I couldn't deny that, with long dark hair styled in perfect waves. David was beaming. You could tell he was in love by the way he looked at her, how he rushed to pull out her chair for her to sit down. I made coffee and served the orange pound cake I had baked that morning. Samantha ate delicately, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin after each bite. She talked about her job at a department store, about how she had studied business administration but hadn't finished her degree. She said she loved the decoration of my house, although I noticed her eyes scanning the walls with a certain evaluation, as if she were calculating something. But I wanted to believe she was a good person, that she would make my son happy. After all, David deserved love and a family of his own. They started dating seriously. David brought her to dinner 2 or 3 times a week. I cooked his favorite meals, set the table nicely, tried to make Samantha feel welcome. She always thanked me, always smiled, but there was something in that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sometimes she made small, almost imperceptible comments. She'd say things like the house was cozy for being so old, or that my cooking was good, even if I used a bit too much salt. Comments that sounded like compliments but left a bitter taste in your mouth. A year later, David gave me the news. They were getting married. Samantha was pregnant. My heart filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, I was happy my son was starting a family. On the other, something inside me tensed up, a silent alarm I didn't know how to interpret at the time. I gave them my blessing, hugged them, told them I would support them in everything, and I kept my word. I paid for a good portion of the wedding, and I sewed Samantha's wedding dress with my own hands, an elegant design in ivory fabric that fit her perfectly. The wedding was small but beautiful. Samantha looked radiant in the dress I had worked on for weeks, every stitch made with love for my new daughter-in-law. David couldn't stop looking at her, and I watched them exchange vows with tears in my eyes. I thought maybe I had been wrong about my doubts, that Samantha would be a good wife and mother. Maybe those odd comments were just my imagination, my fear of losing my son. But then came the conversation that would change everything. 3 days after the wedding, David and Samantha showed up at my house with suitcases. Samantha had had a miscarriage. She was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. David looked devastated. They told me between sobs, hugging each other in my living room, and I cried with them. I made them tea, comforted them, told them they were young and could try again when they were ready. Then David made the request. He said they had to leave the apartment they were renting because, with the wedding and medical expenses, they were out of money. He asked if they could stay with me for just a few months, just until they got back on their feet financially and could rent something new. He looked at me with those eyes I had known since he was a baby, the same eyes he used to ask me for things when he was a child. How was I going to say no to my only son at such a difficult time? I told them yes. Of course I told them yes. My house had 2 bedrooms. David could have the one that had always been his, and I would stay in mine. It was temporary, just a few months until they stabilized. What could possibly happen in just a few months? That same afternoon I helped them settle their things, washed the sheets, put clean towels in the bathroom. I prepared a special dinner to lift their spirits. Samantha barely touched her food but thanked me with a weak smile. The first week was quiet. Samantha spent most of her time in the bedroom, recovering physically and emotionally. I brought her food, made her herbal teas, tried to give her space while she processed the loss. David went to and from work, looking more stressed each day by the debts they had accumulated. I didn't ask much, just offered my quiet support and my house as a refuge. But in the second week, something started to change. Samantha came out of the bedroom more often, starting to move around the house with a different energy. One morning I found her moving the living room furniture. She had pushed my favorite armchair into the corner and moved the coffee table toward the window. When I asked what she was doing, she said she just wanted to let more light in, that the old layout made everything look too dark. She said it so naturally that I didn't know how to object without sounding difficult. Another day, I came home from grocery shopping and found she had changed the kitchen curtains. The white ones I had sewn were folded on a chair, and in their place hung some brown ones she had bought. She said they matched the cabinets better. I just stared at my folded curtains, the ones I had made so carefully, and felt a lump in my throat. But I said nothing. After all, she was grieving. Maybe she just needed to feel like she had control over something. The weeks turned into months. Every time I mentioned how the apartment hunt was going, David would say they hadn't saved enough for the deposit yet, that prices were too high, that they just needed a little more time. And I would nod, because he was my son, and I couldn't throw him out on the street. But Samantha no longer acted like a temporary guest. She acted as if the house were hers. She started cooking without asking me, using my pots and pans, leaving them dirty in the sink for me to wash later. When I cooked, she'd make comments about how I'd used too much spice, or that the meat was too dry. She invited her friends over without telling me, and I'd come home to find my living room full of strangers who looked at me like I was the one interrupting. One of those afternoons, one of her friends asked me if I was the housekeeper. Samantha laughed and said no, I was her mother-in-law, but she didn't correct her friend when she assumed the house belonged to them. My sewing machine, my work tool, my source of income, started to bother her. She complained that the noise didn't let her sleep, even though I only sewed during the day. She said the threads and fabrics scattered around made the house look messy. One day I came home and found she had stuffed several of my projects into boxes and stored them in the closet. When I protested, she told me she needed to make space, that I could sew some other time, that it wasn't a big deal. But the worst part wasn't what she did. It was what she said. The worst part was the words. Those small, poisoned phrases that Samantha would drop with a smile as if they were simple observations. Comments that started as occasional and then became daily, constant, like water dripping on a stone until it wears it down. She'd say things like, "At your age, you should be thinking about resting," that working so much with the sewing was going to make you blind, that older women need help because their memory starts to fail and it's dangerous for them to live alone. But I wasn't living alone. I was living in my own house with two people who were supposed to be my family. When my friend Margaret came to visit, as she had done for years, Samantha would look annoyed. She'd sigh loudly, slam doors, turn up the volume on the television. One afternoon, Margaret and I were having coffee in the kitchen when Samantha came in and said she needed to make dinner. And could we please go talk somewhere else because she needed the space? Margaret looked at me uncomfortably, and we finished our conversation standing in the small backyard. After that day, Margaret started visiting less. I knew she felt unwelcome, that she didn't want to cause me trouble with my daughter-in-law. Sundays had always been sacred to me. It was the day I cooked something special, when the house smelled like home cooking and family. But Samantha started suggesting they just order takeout, that I was too tired to cook and should save my energy. When I insisted on cooking anyway, she would eat just a few bites and then say she was too full, leaving her plate almost untouched. David would end up eating more of her portion than mine, and I'd watch as my food got cold on the plates, rejected. One night, I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had gone to the bathroom, and on my way back, I passed David's room. The door was slightly open, and Samantha's voice slipped through the crack. She was on the phone with someone, probably a friend. She was saying that living with her mother-in-law was unbearable, that I was a nosy old woman who didn't know when to step aside, that the house was old and small, but at least they weren't paying rent, and that she just had to hold on a little longer until and here she paused, until I wasn't a problem anymore. She didn't specify what that meant, but the tone of her voice chilled my blood. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. I felt my stomach turn, my legs tremble. I went back to my room like a sleepwalker and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I couldn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my own house that no longer felt like mine. The clock ticked away the hours, and I tossed and turned in the sheets, wondering at what point I had lost control of my life. The next day, I confronted David. I asked to speak with him alone and told him I needed to know when they planned on leaving, that 6 months had passed, and I needed my space back. David looked at me, surprised, as if the idea of leaving were completely new. He told me they still didn't have enough money, that things were tough, and how could I even think of kicking them out when Samantha was still recovering? I told him I wasn't kicking them out. I was just asking for a plan, for an approximate date. He got angry. He told me he couldn't believe I was being so selfish, that they were my family and families support each other. He stormed out, slamming the door and leaving me alone in the kitchen, feeling as if I were the villain in this story. Samantha must have found out about the conversation because that night at dinner, the atmosphere was tense and cold. Nobody spoke. The sound of silverware against the plates was the only thing that broke the uncomfortable silence. When we finished, David and Samantha went straight to their room and closed the door. I washed the dishes alone, as I had started to do all the time, and wondered how I had come to feel like a stranger in the place I had bought with the sweat of my brow. The months kept passing. 8, 9, 10 months living together. Samantha was becoming less subtle with her hostility. She stopped greeting me in the mornings. When I entered a room, she would leave. If I was watching television in the living room, she would come in and change the channel without asking. She started receiving packages, large boxes that a delivery driver would leave at the door. She bought a new lamp for the living room, a large mirror for the hallway, new cushions for the sofa. Things that were slowly changing the look of my house, erasing my footprint and putting down hers. One day I worked up the courage and told her to please stop buying things for the house without consulting me first, that it was my home and I had the right to decide how it looked. Samantha looked at me as if I had said the most ridiculous thing in the world. She let out a dry laugh and told me she was just trying to modernize the place a bit, that everything looked so antiquated and depressing, that if she was going to live here, she at least wanted it to look presentable. The way she said live here, as if it were permanent, as if there were no going back, made my skin crawl. I spoke with David again. I begged him to understand my position, that I loved them, but I needed my life back. That 11 months was no longer temporary. He told me I was being dramatic, that Samantha was just trying to help the house look better. I reminded him that it was my house, that I had bought it, that I had the deed in my name. He fell silent for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then he said something that broke my heart. He said that technically, yes, it was my house, but morally, I had an obligation to share it with my family. That he was my only son, and when had I started to value a pile of bricks more than my own blood? I was speechless, breathless. David left my room, and I just sat there, trying to process what I had just heard. My son, the boy I had raised alone, to whom I had given everything, was using my sacrifices against me. He was twisting my maternal love to make me feel guilty for wanting my own space. That night, I pulled out the metal box I kept under my bed. There it was, the deed to the house, the document that proved this place was mine. I held it in my trembling hands and read my name over and over. Helen Miller, homeowner. I remembered all the years I spent sewing until my fingers bled, all the double shifts, all the sleepless nights. This house was my entire life's work, and no one had the right to make me feel bad for defending it. But I was also a mother, and the years of sacrifice had taught me to put David's needs before my own. Maybe I just needed to be more patient. Maybe things would get better. I put the deed back in the box, hid it under the bed, and tried to convince myself that everything would be okay. I had no idea how wrong I was. Because the worst was yet to come. A full year passed. 12 months since David and Samantha arrived with their suitcases, saying it would only be temporary. The house didn't feel like mine at all anymore. Every corner had Samantha's mark on it, from the new pictures on the walls to the gray towel set she had put in the bathroom. My things were slowly disappearing, put away in boxes, relegated to corners, as if I were the one just passing through and not them. My sewing business was suffering. Clients stopped calling as often because Samantha had made it clear she didn't like having strangers in the house. When someone came by to pick up a dress or get measured, she would look annoyed, sigh loudly, and make comments about how the house looks like a shop. Several clients told me they'd rather find another seamstress because they felt uncomfortable with the atmosphere. I was losing the business I had spent years building, the reputation I had earned through hard work. My income started to drop. I, who had always been self-sufficient, who had never asked anyone for a penny, was starting to see my savings dwindle. Because even though David and Samantha lived in my house, they contributed very little. At first, they said they would pay half the utilities, but they always had excuses. They had unexpected expenses this month, next paycheck for sure. Don't worry, they'd get caught up soon. But the day to get caught up never came. I ended up paying for the water, the electricity, the gas, the food. They ate from my refrigerator, used my electricity for their gadgets, showered with my hot water. And when I hinted at anything about the expenses, Samantha would look at me as if I were the cheapest person in the world. She'd say, "How can you charge your own family? What kind of mother-in-law are you?" David would just look away, uncomfortable, but never defended me. One afternoon I was sewing a yellow dress for a prom, one of the few orders I had left. It was delicate work, with beadwork that had to be sewn by hand. I had been concentrating for hours when Samantha entered my room without knocking. She said she needed me to do her a favor, that she had an important job interview and needed me to fix a pair of pants. I told her, of course, just leave them and I'd have them ready in 2 days. She got upset. She said she needed them for tomorrow. How could I not have time to help my own daughter-in-law? I explained that I had to finish the prom dress first, that it was a paid commitment. Samantha huffed and said I always put strangers before family. She grabbed the yellow dress from my hands, looked at it with contempt, and threw it onto the bed. I froze, watching as the delicate fabric wrinkled. As some of the pearls I had so carefully sewn came loose, I asked her to get out of my room. She smiled, that cold smile I knew so well, and walked out slowly, savoring my frustration. I had to work until 3 o'clock in the morning to repair the damage and finish the dress on time. My eyes were burning, my back was destroyed, but I couldn't let my client down. When I delivered the dress, the girl's mother noticed my exhaustion and asked if I was okay. I told her yes, it had just been a heavy week. But the truth was, every week was heavier than the last. The final straw came on a Thursday afternoon. I had gone to the grocery store to buy vegetables, and when I returned, I found Samantha sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of papers in front of her. She was calculating something on a calculator, frowning as she wrote numbers in a notebook. I got closer and saw they were the utility bills for the house, the water, electric, gas, and phone bills, all in my name. I asked her what she was doing. She looked up and told me, completely naturally, that she was reviewing the household expenses, that she had noticed I was paying for everything, and that wasn't fair. For a moment, I thought she was finally going to offer to contribute as she should. But no. What she said next left me breathless. Samantha said she had been thinking that I should be contributing more to the household expenses, that they were 2 people and I was only 1, but we all ate the same amount, that I used more hot water because I showered earlier, that my sewing machine used a lot of electricity, that the fair thing would be to split the costs 3 ways, but considering I used more resources, I should pay 40% while they would each pay 30%. I just stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. I was in my own house, the house I had bought, and my daughter-in-law was telling me how much I had to pay for utilities. I told her no, that this was ridiculous, that it was my house, and if anyone should be paying more, it was them, who had been living here for free for a year. Samantha slammed the notebook shut and looked at me with narrowed eyes. She said I was selfish, that I didn't understand the concept of family, that she and David had done me a favor by coming to live with me so I wouldn't be alone in this big house, that at my age, it's dangerous to live alone, that I could fall, get sick, or die, and nobody would even notice for days. The way she said it, cold and calculated, made me understand something terrible. Samantha wasn't here out of necessity. She was here because she wanted my house. She had seen an older woman, alone, with property, with no other family than a manipulable son, and had decided I was easy prey. Every comment about my age, every insinuation about my health, every mention of how dangerous it was to live alone, it had all been part of a plan to make me feel like I was the one who needed them, and not the other way around. That night, I pulled the metal box out from under my bed again. I opened the deed and read it completely, every word, every clause. The house was 100% in my name. David had no legal right to it. I could ask them to leave whenever I wanted, But he was my son, my only son, the boy I had raised alone, to whom I had given everything. How could I throw him out on the street? I decided to try one last conversation. I asked David to talk, without Samantha present. I invited him to breakfast at a diner near his work. When we sat across from each other, I looked at my son and searched his eyes for the boy he had been. I told him, with all the love I could gather, that I needed them to leave, that I loved them, but I couldn't go on like this, that I needed my house, my space, my life back. David didn't let me finish. He stood up from the table, threw his napkin onto his untouched plate, and told me he couldn't believe I was being so cruel. That Samantha was right about me, that I was a bitter old woman who preferred to be alone than surrounded by family, that I was going to regret this when I was old and sick and had no one to take care of me. He walked out of the diner, leaving me sitting there, with tears rolling down my cheeks while the other customers looked at me with pity. I returned home with a shattered heart. I had lost my son. Samantha had completely poisoned him against me. He no longer saw me as his mother, but as an obstacle, as someone selfish who stood in the way of his happiness. I went into my room, locked the door, and cried for hours. I cried for the lost years, for the wasted sacrifice, for the son I had raised who now treated me like an enemy. But something changed in me that night. Between the tears and the pain, something hardened inside my chest. A decision, cold and clear as ice. I was not going to let them take what was mine, not after everything I had fought for to get it. That night, while David and Samantha slept in the room that was once just my son's, I stayed awake making a plan. I gathered all the important documents, the deed to the house, the payment receipts, the utility bills in my name. I organized everything into a folder and put it in a safe place. If this was going to end badly, I needed to be prepared. The next few days were strange. Samantha and David barely spoke to me. They ate in their room, left early, and came back late. I used that time to call some of my old clients, to try and get back some of the business I had lost. Margaret came to visit me one afternoon, and I told her everything that was happening. She hugged me while I cried and told me I had every right to ask them to leave, that this was my house and my life. But then something happened that changed everything. One Tuesday afternoon, I was in my room sewing when I heard raised voices in the living room. It was Samantha on the phone, and even though I didn't want to listen, her voice was so loud it came right through the walls. She was talking to someone about money, about an investment. She mentioned an amount, $20,000. She said they would have access to that money soon, that it was just a matter of time. My blood ran cold. I had exactly $20,000 saved. It was the money I had put away for years, my safety net, what I had left after buying the house and maintaining it. I had it in a bank account in my name, but David knew about those savings. I had mentioned it to him years ago, back when I still trusted him completely, back when he was still my boy and not this stranger living in my house. I left my room, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it would burst from my chest. Samantha had already hung up the phone and was in the kitchen making coffee. I asked her directly what money she was talking about. She turned around with that cold smile that terrified me. She told me not to worry about it, that it was none of my business. I told her that if she was talking about my savings, then it was absolutely my business. Samantha set her mug down on the counter with a thud, spilling coffee. She told me that money should be for the whole family, not just me. That I was a selfish old woman who was hoarding resources that could help my son get ahead. That David deserved that money more than I did because he has his whole life ahead of him while I've already lived mine. That the fair thing would be for me to put up that money so they could invest it in a business, in their future. I told her she was completely crazy if she thought I was going to give them my money, that it was the fruit of my labor, my sacrifices, and I had no obligation to share it with anyone. Samantha got close to me, so close I could see the veins in her neck, the pure hatred in her eyes. She told me that one way or another, that money would be theirs, that I had no one else, that when I died, everything would go to David anyway. So why not just give it to them now when it could make a difference? The way she said when I died didn't sound like a distant event. It sounded like a threat, like a plan. I backed away, terrified, and locked myself in my room. My hands were shaking as I dialed the bank's number. I spoke to a representative and told them I wanted to change the conditions on my account. that no one but me could make withdrawals or transactions. They asked me some security questions and confirmed the changes. At least my savings were safe. But I wasn't. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jump. I wondered if Samantha was capable of truly hurting me. If my own son would let something like that happen. The David I knew never would have. But that David didn't exist anymore. This new David was so blinded by his wife that he couldn't see reality. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. Something bad was going to happen. I could feel it in my bones. I got up early and made coffee with trembling hands. David and Samantha came out of their room later, and I noticed David was holding some papers. They sat at the kitchen table and called me over. David's tone was strangely formal, as if he were in a business meeting and not his own home. I sat across from them, feeling the floor move beneath my feet. David put the papers on the table and pushed them toward me. He said they had been thinking a lot about the house situation, that they had been living here for over a year and could legally claim residency rights, that they had consulted with a lawyer and that there was something called de facto residency, that after living in a place for a certain amount of time, you could claim rights to the property. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son was threatening to take my house from me using legal technicalities. I asked him if he was serious. He avoided my gaze, and it was Samantha who answered. She said they didn't want to resort to that they preferred to reach a civilized agreement, that the fair thing would be for me to transfer the house into David's name, and in exchange, they would let me live here for the rest of my life. That they would even give me my own room and wouldn't charge me rent. They would let me live in my own house, without charging me rent, as if they were doing me a favor, as if the 20 years I worked to buy this property meant nothing, as if all my sacrifices were invisible. Rage began to boil in my veins. A rage so intense I felt like I was going to choke on it. I told them to go to hell, that this house was mine, that I had the deed in my name, and that no cheap lawyer was going to help them steal it from me, that they had 3 days to pack their things and get out, or I would call the police myself and have them removed. David slammed the table with his fist, making the cups jump. He yelled at me that I couldn't just kick them out, that he was my son, that he had rights. I yelled back that the only right he had was to have been loved and raised by me, and that he had trampled on that right every single day for the last year, that the house was mine and mine alone, and if they wanted a property so badly, they should work and buy their own, just like I did. Samantha jumped up, her face red with fury. She pointed her finger at me and said I was going to regret this, that I would end up alone and abandoned, just like I deserved. I told them I would rather be alone than surrounded by snakes like them, that they should get out of my sight before I did something I regretted. David and Samantha stormed out of the kitchen, slamming their bedroom door so hard it shook the walls. I sat at the table, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd have a heart attack. But I also felt something else. I felt power. I felt like I had finally gotten my voice back. That afternoon I went straight to see a real lawyer, not the charlatans they had found. I told him the whole situation and showed him my documents. The lawyer reviewed the deed and told me the house was 100% mine, that they had no legal right to it no matter how long they had lived there, that I could ask them to leave at any time, and that if they refused, I could start the eviction process. I felt relieved but also sad, because although I was legally in the right, emotionally I was devastated. He was my son, my only son, and I had reached the point of having to threaten him with lawyers and police to get my own house back. I returned home with the lawyer's documents in my purse and an iron determination in my chest. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. I wasn't going to feel guilty for defending what was mine. When I walked in, the house was silent. I thought maybe David and Samantha had gone out, but then I heard voices coming from my bedroom, my room. I ran down the hall and threw open the door. Samantha was kneeling next to my bed, with the metal box in her hands, my box, the one I kept under the mattress with all my important documents. She had forced the lock and was going through the contents, pulling out papers, reading them with greedy eyes. David was standing next to her, watching the door as if he were on guard duty. When they saw me, neither of them had the decency to look ashamed. I screamed at them, asking what the hell they were doing in my room, touching my things. Samantha held up the deed to the house and waved it in the air. She said they were just verifying the documents were authentic, that they had a right to know what they were dealing with. I snatched the deed from her hands so hard it almost tore. I told her she had no right to enter my room, to touch my things, to go through my private documents. David stepped forward and told me to stop being dramatic, that they lived here and had a right to know their legal situation, that I was hiding information that concerned them. I told him the only information that concerned them was that they had 72 hours to get out of my house before I called the police. Samantha let out a bitter laugh, a laugh full of poison. She said she wasn't going anywhere, that this house was as much hers as it was mine, and that if anyone was leaving, it was me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who had come into my house as a temporary guest, who had lived off my generosity for over a year, was now telling me that I had to leave. I told her she was completely insane, that the house had my name on the deed, that I had paid every cent, that I had worked like an animal for 20 years to buy it. Samantha shrugged as if none of that mattered. She said possession is 9/10 of the law, that they were living here, their things were here, that they had made improvements to the property with the curtains and furniture they had bought, that any judge would see they had just as much right as I did. I told her she was wrong, that I had consulted with a real lawyer and she didn't have the slightest chance of keeping my house. Then Samantha did something I will never forget. She got close to me until our faces were inches apart. I could smell her sweet perfume, see the hatred shining in her pupils. She told me in a low voice, almost a whisper, that I was an old fool if I thought I could beat them, that they were young and strong, and I was just an old, lonely woman. That accidents happen all the time to people my age. Falls down the stairs, slipping in the shower, sudden heart problems. That it would be a real shame if something like that happened to me. Fear shot through me like electricity. This wasn't my imagination. Samantha was directly threatening me. She was implying they could hurt me, maybe even kill me, to get my house. I looked at David, searching for any sign that he would defend me, that he would tell his wife she was crazy. But David just stared at the floor, his fists clenched, saying nothing. My son was allowing his wife to threaten my life. I backed out of the door, clutching the metal box to my chest. I told them with a trembling voice that they were going to regret this, that I was going to call the police right now. Samantha laughed and told me, "Go ahead, call them. Tell the police your daughter-in-law said mean words to you. See if they come for something like that. You just sound like a paranoid, senile old woman." I ran out of my room, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, trying to calm my breathing. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. I dialed Margaret's number, and when she answered, the words poured out of me between sobs. I told her everything, the threats, the forced open box, the fear I felt in my own home. Margaret told me to pack a bag and come stay with her tonight, that it wasn't safe for me to stay there. But something inside me rebelled against that idea. If I left, even for just one night, I would be leaving my house in their hands. I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. They would win, and I would lose. No, I was not going to run from what was mine. I was going to stay and fight. I told Margaret I was fine, that I wasn't going to let them kick me out. She insisted but finally accepted, making me promise to call her if anything happened. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on my bed with the light on, listening to every noise in the house. I heard David and Samantha's footsteps in the hall, their muffled voices arguing about something I couldn't understand. Every time I heard them get close to my door, my heart raced. I had the phone in my hand, ready to dial 911 if they tried anything. But nothing happened that night. The next morning, I left my room exhausted and a nervous wreck. David had already left for work. Samantha was in the kitchen making breakfast as if nothing had happened. She glanced at me when I came in but said nothing. I didn't speak either. The silence between us was dense, heavy with hostility. I made myself coffee, my hands still shaking. Every move Samantha made put me on high alert. When she went near the knife drawer, I stepped back. When she walked behind me, I turned to keep her in my line of sight. Living like this was unbearable. I couldn't keep feeling scared in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if every meal might be poisoned or if every night might be my last. I made a decision. I was going to end this today. I called the lawyer and asked him to prepare the eviction papers immediately. He said he could have them ready in 2 hours. I told him that was perfect, that I would wait. Then I called the local police precinct and asked if they could send an officer to supervise and keep the peace when I served the documents. They said yes, they would send a patrol car around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The hours passed slowly. Samantha left the house around noon, probably to meet a friend and complain about her horrible mother-in-law. I used the time to take some of my most valuable things to Margaret's house. Family photos, jewelry that had belonged to my mother, important documents. I wasn't going to risk them destroying my memories in a fit of rage. At 2 o'clock, I went to the lawyer's office and picked up the papers. The formal eviction, giving them 15 days to vacate the property. The lawyer explained that although the law said 72 hours, since they had lived there for over a year, they were entitled to 2 weeks. 15 more days, sharing a house with people who hated me, who had threatened me. But at least I would have the backing of the law. I got back home just as David was arriving from work. Samantha was already back, too. The 3 of us were in the living room when there was a knock at the door. It was the police officers. David turned pale. Samantha jumped up, asking what was going on. I opened the door and let the 2 officers in. One was a woman, about 40, with a serious but kind expression. The other was an older man who looked at the scene professionally. I explained the situation calmly. That David was my son, that he and his wife had been living in my house temporarily, that the arrangement was over, and that I was now formally asking them to leave. I took out the deed and showed it to the officers. They reviewed it and nodded. Everything was in order. The house was mine. Then I took out the eviction papers and handed them to David. David took the papers with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the lines as the color drained from his face. Samantha snatched the documents from him and began to read them, her expression growing more furious. When she finished reading, she looked at me with a hatred so pure I felt it burn. The female officer explained in a calm voice that the papers were legal and binding, that they had 15 days to vacate the property, or they would face more severe legal consequences. Samantha screamed that this was an outrage, that I couldn't just throw them out on the street like this, that David is your son, and mothers don't do this. The officer replied that Mrs. Miller was the sole owner of the home and had every legal right to ask them to vacate, that if they had questions, they could consult their own lawyer, but the papers were in order and they had to comply. David finally spoke. His voice sounded broken, small, nothing like the man who had lifted a chair against me. He asked me how I could do this to them. How could you throw your own son out on the street? I looked him straight in the eye and told him, "You made this decision when you allowed your wife to threaten me, when you tried to steal my house, when you broke into my room to go through my things like I was a stranger. You chose Samantha over me, and now you have to live with that choice." The officers stayed for a few more minutes to make sure the situation didn't escalate. Before they left, the female officer gave me her card and told me that if I felt I was in danger, I shouldn't hesitate to call. That they would return in 15 days to ensure the eviction was completed. When they left, the silence in the living room was deafening. David was still holding the papers, staring at them as if he couldn't believe they were real. Samantha was the first to react. She broke the silence with a scream of fury that echoed through the house. She told me I was going to regret this, that I didn't know who I was messing with, that she wasn't just going to leave, that if I wanted a war, I was going to get one. I replied with a calm I didn't know I possessed that the papers spoke for themselves, that they had 15 days and not one more. That after that, if they weren't gone, I would be back with the police, and they would be forcibly removed. David dropped the papers on the floor and walked toward me. For a moment, I thought he was going to yell, but what he did was worse. He looked at me with eyes full of tears and asked, "When did you become so cruel?" He said he thought I loved him, that he always believed that to a mother, nothing was more important than her son. How could you value a house of bricks more than your own blood? I felt something break inside me. I told him that I had loved him more than anything in this world, that I had worked until I destroyed my body to give him everything he needed, that I had stayed alone sewing until the early morning hours so he could have shoes and food and an education, that I bought this house thinking that one day he would inherit something of value, something that represented all my sacrifices. But he had spit on that love when he chose to believe his wife's lies about me, when he treated me like a burden in my own home, when he let her threaten me and did nothing to defend me. I told him that the David I raised, the sweet boy who used to hug me and tell me I was the best mom in the world, that David was dead. That the man standing in front of me was a stranger, manipulated by a calculating woman who only wanted my property. That if he ever woke up and realized what he had done, it would be too late. Because I couldn't keep being hurt by the people who were supposed to love me. David opened his mouth to respond, but Samantha interrupted him. She grabbed his arm and told him not to waste his breath on me, that I had shown my true colors, that I could go to hell with my house and my loneliness. She dragged David toward their room, and they slammed the door so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. I stood in the middle of the living room, trembling from head to toe. I had won the legal battle, but the emotional price was devastating. He was my son, my only son, and I had just kicked him out of my house. I sat on the sofa and cried silently, hugging myself, feeling an emptiness in my chest I had never experienced before. The next few days were hell. David and Samantha didn't speak to me. When I entered a room, they left. They ate locked in their bedroom, leaving dirty dishes in the sink for me to wash. They started packing their things, but they did it with deliberate slowness, as if they wanted to torture me by extending their presence as long as possible. One night, I heard them arguing in their room. David's voice sounded desperate, pleading. He was telling Samantha that maybe they should try talking to me, apologizing, finding a solution. Samantha yelled at him not to be weak, that I was the one who should apologize, that if he lowered himself to beg his mother, she would leave and let him be alone. David went quiet after that. On the 5th day of the eviction period, I came home from the grocery store and noticed something was different. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Several of my pictures were missing from the walls, pictures I had bought with my money that had decorated my house for years. I ran to my room and found several of my things were missing too. An antique jewelry box that had been my mother's, a lamp that had cost me 2 months' work to buy, even some of my best bed linens. I stormed out of my room and pounded on David and Samantha's door. Samantha opened it with an innocent expression. I asked her where my things were. She shrugged and said she didn't know what I was talking about. That if things were missing, maybe I had lost them. That at my age it's normal to start forgetting where you leave things. I told her I knew perfectly well she had taken them and to return them immediately, or I would call the police. Samantha smiled that cold smile that made my skin crawl. She told me, "Go ahead, call the police. Tell them your daughter-in-law took a few things from the house she lives in. See if they believe an old woman with memory problems or a young, sane woman. Besides, who's going to prove those things were yours and not ours? You don't have receipts, they're antiques from years ago." She was right, and we both knew it. I couldn't prove those objects were mine. I didn't have dated photos showing they were in my house before they arrived. It was my word against hers. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I told her she could keep those things if she needed them that badly. That they were just objects after all, but on day 15, I would be here with the police. And she had better be out with all her belongings, or she would face criminal charges. Samantha narrowed her eyes, and for a moment I thought she was going to hit me. But David appeared behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. He said something quietly to her that I couldn't hear. Samantha gave me one last look of hatred and closed the door in my face. I went back to my room feeling like my whole body ached. It wasn't a physical pain, but something deeper. A pain in my soul. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about all the years I had worked to build a life. How it had all fallen apart in just 15 months. How I had lost my son in the process. But I also thought about how I hadn't let them defeat me, that I had fought for what was mine, that I hadn't stayed silent while they trampled me. I had found a strength inside myself I didn't know existed, a strength born from years of struggle, of survival, of getting up every time life knocked me down. The following days passed in unbearable tension. David and Samantha packed boxes and moved them out of the house. I stayed in my room most of the time, only coming out when I knew they weren't there. Margaret came to visit me every day to make sure I was okay. She brought me food because I barely had an appetite. She hugged me while I cried. Finally, the 15th day arrived. I woke up that day with a knot in my stomach. It was the last day of the deadline. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the police officers would arrive to supervise that David and Samantha had completely vacated. I got dressed with care, choosing a simple but dignified outfit. I wanted to look strong, not like the victim they had made me feel for so long. I pulled my hair back, put on a little lipstick, and looked in the mirror. I saw a woman who had survived worse things than this. I left my room and found the house in a chaotic state. There were boxes everywhere, trash bags full of clothes, furniture moved out of place. David was carrying things to a moving van they had rented, which was parked in front of the house. Samantha was in the living room, packing the last few items with abrupt, angry movements. When she saw me, she shot me a venomous look, but said nothing. I made myself coffee in the kitchen, trying to ignore the chaos around me. My hands trembled slightly as I held the mug. Just a few more hours until this was all over. A few more hours to get my house, my peace, my life back. But also, a few more hours to confirm that I had lost my son forever. The price of my freedom was my relationship with David, and although I knew I had done the right thing, the pain was unbearable. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, most of their things were loaded into the van. David was coming in and out of the house, sweating, his shirt sticking to his body from the effort. Every time he passed me, he averted his gaze. He couldn't look me in the eye because he knew what he had done was wrong. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him wake up and see the truth. But the other part, the tired and wounded part, just wanted them to leave. Samantha came out of the room they had occupied carrying the last box. She dropped it on the floor with a thud and stood in front of me, her arms crossed. She told me she hoped I was happy, that I had gotten what I wanted, that now I could rot alone in this ugly old house, that when I was sick and dying, there would be no one to take care of me, that I would die alone like the bitter old woman I was. I replied that I would rather die alone and in peace than live surrounded by people who hated me, that she could think whatever she wanted of me, but at the end of the day, this house was mine, and I had won. Samantha clenched her fists and took a step toward me. For a moment, I thought she was going to hit me. And honestly, I didn't even care anymore. But David appeared right then and grabbed her arm, telling her that's enough, let's just go. Then Samantha did something I will never forget. She turned toward the living room and with a swift movement grabbed one of the vases left on the shelf. It was an antique vase that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the few things of sentimental value I had left. Before I could react, Samantha smashed it on the floor. The vase shattered into pieces, fragments of painted ceramic flying in every direction. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence of the house. I stood frozen, staring at the pieces of my vase scattered on the floor. That vase had survived decades. It had been passed down from generation to generation. It was one of the last connections I had to my grandmother. And now it was destroyed, broken into 1,000 pieces out of pure spite. I felt tears burning my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I wouldn't give Samantha the satisfaction of seeing me cry. David looked at the pieces on the floor with a shocked expression. Even he seemed horrified by what his wife had just done. He said to her, "How could you do that? You're crazy." Samantha shrugged and said, "It was just an ugly old vase. Now you have one less piece of junk to worry about." She walked toward the door, deliberately stepping on the fragments, making them crunch under her shoes. In that moment, something broke inside me too. It wasn't just sadness or pain, it was pure rage. Rage for all the months of humiliation, for the threats, for the manipulation, for seeing my son turned into a stranger. Rage for that broken vase that represented everything I had lost. I walked to the door where Samantha was standing and told her, with a voice so cold it surprised even me, "Get out of my house right now, before I call the police for destruction of property." Samantha laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. She said, "Yeah, we're leaving. This place stinks of old lady and failure anyway. David deserves better than a selfish mother who chooses walls over her own blood." She opened the door and walked out to the van. David stood in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. There was pain in his eyes, but also something else. Regret? Confusion? He took a step toward me and opened his mouth as if he was going to say something. I waited, my heart pounding, wondering if he was finally going to apologize, if he was going to acknowledge all the damage they had caused. But then Samantha screamed his name from the van, telling him to hurry up. David closed his mouth, gave me one last look, and walked out the door. I stood in the doorway watching him get into the van. Watching my son, the boy I had raised, the baby I had held in my arms, drive away from me, maybe forever. The van started and began to pull away down the street. I watched until it disappeared from view, until the only thing left was the dust its tires had kicked up. At exactly 3 o'clock, the police car arrived. The same 2 officers from before got out of the car and walked up to the door. I told them that David and Samantha were already gone, that they had vacated before the deadline. The female officer asked for permission to inspect the property to ensure they had indeed taken all their belongings. I nodded and let them in. We walked through the house together. The room that had been David's was empty, except for the bed and the dresser that had always been in there. The bathroom was clear of their things. The living room was messy but free of their possessions. The officers took notes and told me everything was in order, that the eviction had been successfully completed. They gave me a signed document certifying that the property had been vacated. When the officers left, I closed the door and threw the bolt. The silence that filled the house was absolute. For the first time in 15 months, I was completely alone in my own home. I leaned against the door and finally let the tears fall. I cried for everything I had lost. For my son who was no longer my son, for the years I had dedicated to raising him, only for it to end like this, for that broken vase on the floor that I could never repair. But I also cried with relief, because it was over, because I had survived, because my house was mine again. I slid down to the floor, my back against the door, hugging my knees, letting the tears wash away all the poison that had built up for months. I cried until there were no tears left, until all that remained was a deep exhaustion in my bones. When I finally managed to get up, I walked through the house, looking at every corner. There was a lot to clean, a lot to repair. The walls had marks where they had hung their things. The floor was scratched from dragging furniture. The kitchen was filthy. The bathroom needed a deep cleaning, but all of that could be fixed. All of that was superficial. I went to my room and pulled the metal box out from under the bed. I opened it and counted the money inside. I still had my savings intact, thanks to blocking the account in time. I had enough to live with dignity, to repair the house, to move on. I took the deed in my hands and held it against my chest. This house was mine. No one had taken it from me. I had fought, and I had won. Margaret arrived an hour later, just as we had planned. She brought food and a bottle of wine. She hugged me tight and told me she was proud of me, that I had done the right thing, even though it was painful. We ate dinner together in my kitchen, talking quietly, planning how I was going to rebuild my life now that I was free. That night, I slept in my bed without startling at every noise for the first time in months. The first few days after they left were strange. The house felt too big and too quiet at the same time. I'd wake up in the mornings and, for a moment, forget they were gone, and then I'd remember and feel a mix of relief and sadness. I had won my house back, but I had lost my son in the process. That thought haunted me at night, when everything was dark and quiet. But I decided not to stay paralyzed by the pain. I started cleaning the house from top to bottom. I scrubbed every surface, washed every corner, removed every trace of Samantha's presence. I hired a painter to redo the walls, choosing a light yellow color that made everything feel brighter and more hopeful. I bought new curtains, white and simple, just like the ones I had always loved. Slowly, my house began to feel like mine again. I called my old clients, one by one. I explained that I had been dealing with family problems but was now fully available to take on work again. Some had already found other seamstresses, but several told me they were glad I was back, that they had missed my work. The orders started coming in again. Dresses for weddings, pant alterations, special embroidery. My sewing machine started humming by the window again, and the sound filled me with peace. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the eviction, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and found a young woman I didn't know. She was holding a lilac-colored dress in a plastic bag and asked if I was the Mrs. Miller who did alterations. I told her I was. She explained that her sister was getting married in 2 weeks and needed her bridesmaid dress adjusted. I invited her in and took her measurements. As I worked, she told me about the wedding, about how excited her sister was. There was joy in her voice, hope. It reminded me that life goes on, that there were still good things. Margaret came to visit me almost every day. We'd have coffee in the kitchen and talk about everything and nothing. She never mentioned David unless I brought him up first. She was considerate that way. She knew when to push and when to let things be. She helped me buy new furniture to replace some of the things that had been damaged. We went to a flea market together and found a beautiful dark wood dining table. We brought it home, laughing like schoolgirls as we struggled to get it up the stairs. A month after the eviction, I adopted a cat. It was a stray that showed up in my backyard one morning, thin and scared. I gave him milk and tuna, and he stayed. I named him Peace because that's what I had finally found in my life. Peace became my constant companion. He slept at the foot of my bed, sat next to me while I sewed, followed me around the house. His presence filled the silence in a way that comforted me. The weeks turned into months. Summer gave way to fall. The leaves on the trees in front of my house turned orange and brown, falling gently onto the yard. I kept working, sewing, rebuilding my life piece by piece. The pain over David was still there, a wound that hadn't fully healed, but I learned to live with it. I learned that a mother's love doesn't disappear just because your child disappoints you. But I also learned that loving them doesn't mean you let them destroy you. One afternoon in November, 4 months after they left, I was watering the plants in the yard when I saw a familiar figure walking down the street. It was David. He was alone, hands in his pockets, walking slowly as if he were gathering the courage for something. He stopped in front of my house and just stood there, staring at the door. I stayed motionless, the hose in my hand, not knowing what to do. Finally, David walked up the driveway. He saw me standing in the yard and stopped. We looked at each other in silence for a moment that felt like an eternity. I noticed he looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, his clothes wrinkled. He looked like someone who had been through hard times. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. I saw his eyes fill with tears. I asked him where Samantha was. David looked down and told me she had left him, that 2 weeks after they moved out, she had met another man, someone with more money and better prospects. That one morning he woke up and she was just gone, having taken half their things and left a note saying she didn't want to be with him anymore. He said he had been living in a tiny apartment, barely able to pay rent, eating just enough to get by. He told me he was sorry, that he had been a blind idiot, that Samantha had manipulated him from the beginning, making him believe I was the problem when it was really her. That he had realized, far too late, that he had lost the only person who had ever truly loved him unconditionally, that he had betrayed me in the worst way possible and he didn't expect me to forgive him, but he needed me to know how deeply he regretted it. The tears were streaming freely down his face now. My son, my David, was standing in front of me, broken and repentant. Part of me wanted to run and hug him, to tell him everything was okay, that he could come home. That maternal part that had guided my whole life screamed at me to forgive him immediately. But there was another part, the part that had learned to value itself, that knew some wounds don't heal with simple apologies. I told him I appreciated his words, that I could see he was truly sorry, but that I couldn't just forget everything that had happened. That he had threatened me, that he had allowed his wife to terrorize me in my own home, that he had tried to take away what I had worked my entire life to build, that those things leave scars that don't just disappear overnight. David nodded, sobbing. He said he understood, that he didn't deserve my forgiveness, that he just wanted me to know he was sorry and that if one day, even if it's years from now, you can find any space in your heart for me, please consider it. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I called out to him before he reached the street. He stopped and turned to look at me. I told him that forgiveness would take time, that trust had been broken and rebuilding it would be a long and difficult process. But if he was truly sorry, if he really wanted to fix our relationship, we could start slow. Maybe with coffee, once a month. Maybe with honest conversations, with no lies or manipulations. Maybe, with a lot of time and effort, we could find our way back to each other. David looked at me with eyes full of hope and nodded vigorously. He said he would do whatever it takes, that he would wait as long as I needed, that he would work every day to prove he had changed, that he had learned his lesson. We said goodbye with an awkward, clumsy handshake, but there was something there, a small seed of possibility. That night, I sat in my renovated living room, with Peace curled up next to me, and thought about everything that had happened. I had lost so much in these past months, but I had also gained something invaluable. I had found myself. I had discovered I was stronger than I thought, that I could defend what was mine, that my love for my son didn't mean I had to sacrifice my dignity and my peace. The house was silent, but it was no longer an empty, lonely silence. It was a peaceful silence, full of possibility. The freshly painted walls glowed softly in the lamplight. The white curtains moved with the breeze coming through the open window. My sewing machine waited by the window, ready for the next day's work. I looked around my living room and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Gratitude for this house that I had fought so hard to get and to keep. Gratitude for friends like Margaret, who had supported me in the darkest moments. Gratitude for the strength I had found inside myself when I needed it most. And yes, even a little gratitude for everything that had happened, because it had taught me lessons I would never forget. I didn't know if David and I would ever have the relationship we had before. Probably not. Too much had happened. Too much had been broken. But maybe we could build something new, something different but real, something based on mutual respect and clear boundaries, not just on family obligation. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet under the streetlights. It was my street, in front of my house, in my neighborhood. All of this was mine, earned with sweat and tears and years of tireless work. Nobody had handed it to me. Nobody had taken it from me. I had fought for it, and I had won. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to my room. Peace followed me, jumping onto the bed and settling into his usual spot. I lay down between clean sheets that smelled like lavender. In my bed, in my room, in my house. For the first time in over a year, I fell asleep feeling completely safe and at peace. Because in the end, I had learned the most important lesson of all. That valuing myself wasn't selfishness, it was survival. That setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. And that sometimes, to save what really matters, you have to be willing to let it go. Now it was just me, my house, my cat, and the healing silence I had so desperately needed. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough.